You know what's strange? Most people spend their entire lives performing. Not on stage, not in front of cameras, but in every conversation, every social interaction, every moment someone else might be watching. They're constantly adjusting their tone, their posture, their opinions, trying to land somewhere between likable and impressive. And then there are people who just don't. They walk into rooms without scanning for approval. They speak without rehearsing how it'll sound. They exist without needing you to validate that existence. And if you're one of those people, you've probably noticed something unsettling. Everyone else finds this deeply confusing. They call you confident. They call you aloof. They call you intimidating. But here's the thing nobody talks about. It's not confidence. It's not arrogance. It's something far more complex, rooted in how your brain processes social reward, identity, and threat. What you're about to understand today changes completely how you see yourself and why the rest of the world reacts to you the way it does. Let me start by saying this clearly. If you don't feel the need to impress people, that doesn't mean you're cold. It doesn't mean you're antisocial. It doesn't mean you're broken or missing some essential human wiring, because that's what most people will assume. They'll tell you that caring what others think is normal, that wanting to be liked is healthy, that social anxiety is just part of being human, and they're not entirely wrong. For most people, that is normal, but not for you. And the reason isn't what you think. Most people believe that not caring about impressing others is a form of emotional detachment or superiority, that you've transcended the need for approval because you're somehow above it all. But neuroscience tells a very different story. You're not detached. You're just wired to find reward in a completely different place, and that difference is profound. Let's talk about dopamine for a second. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter most associated with motivation and reward. When your brain releases dopamine, it's telling you, this matters, pay attention, do this again. For most people, social approval triggers significant dopamine release. A compliment, a laugh at their joke, a nod of agreement. These moments light up the brain's reward system like a slot machine paying out. The brain learns. Impressing people feels good, so keep doing it. Over time, this becomes automatic. The person doesn't consciously think, I need to impress this stranger. Their brain just starts performing, because performance has been linked to reward. But this is where it gets interesting. In people who don't feel the need to impress, that dopamine link is either weaker or pointed somewhere else entirely. It's not that you don't experience social reward, it's that your brain doesn't prioritize it the same way. Studies on individual differences in reward sensitivity show that some people are naturally less responsive to social reinforcement and more responsive to internal reinforcement. Things like mastery, competence, curiosity, or solitude. Your brain might release dopamine when you solve a problem, finish a project, or have a moment of clarity, not when someone praises you for it. This isn't a choice. It's neurological architecture. And once you understand this, everything about how you move through the world starts to make sense. Now, if you've stuck with me this far, I want to say something. If you're the kind of person who thinks about this stuff, who notices these patterns in yourself and others, who feels a little outside the social script most people follow without question, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for. We dig into the psychology that most people never see, the invisible patterns that shape how we think, feel, and behave. And we do it without judgment, without pathologizing, just deep, honest exploration. So if that resonates, go ahead and subscribe. Not because I'm asking you to, but because people like you tend to find a lot of value in what we explore here. All right, let's keep going. So if your brain doesn't light up the same way when people approve of you, what does that actually look like in real life? It looks like this. You're in a conversation. Someone says something you disagree with. Most people will either stay silent, nod along, or soften their disagreement with 6 layers of diplomatic cushioning. You just say what you think, not rudely, not aggressively, just clearly. And the room shifts, because what you just did, speaking without performing agreement, registers to others as bold. But to you, it's not bold. It's just honest. You weren't trying to impress them with your honesty. You weren't trying to provoke them either. You were just responding to the content of what was said, not the social game underneath it. This is the paradox. The very thing that makes you seem confident to others, your lack of performance, doesn't feel like confidence to you. It feels neutral, which is exactly why most people misread you. Here's another layer. Most people use social interaction as a mirror. They're constantly checking, how am I being perceived right now? Do they like me? Did that land well? Should I adjust? This creates a feedback loop. Their sense of self becomes entangled with how others react to them. If people respond warmly, they feel good. If people seem cold or disinterested, they feel anxious or rejected. Their internal state is outsourced to the crowd. But people who don't feel the need to impress have a different relationship with that mirror. You're not checking it constantly. You might glance at it occasionally, sure. You're not immune to social feedback, but your sense of self doesn't depend on it. You know who you are, whether the room agrees or not. Psychologists call this an internal locus of identity. Your identity is anchored inside, not outside. And this has massive implications for how you experience the world. Let me explain what I mean. Imagine two people walking into the same party. Person A scans the room. Who's here? Who should I talk to? How do I look? What's the vibe? Their nervous system is already activated, preparing to perform. Person B walks in, sees the room, and just exists in it. No scan, no performance prep. They might talk to someone, they might not. Either way, their internal state doesn't shift much. Person A is running social threat detection software in the background at all times. Person B isn't. And here's the key. Person B isn't more confident. They're just not running the same program. Confidence implies you're aware of a potential threat, social judgment, and you're overriding it. But if your brain isn't flagging social judgment as a threat in the first place, there's nothing to override. You're just present. And that presence is what people find so unusual. Because most people are never fully present. They're too busy managing how they're being seen. Now let's talk about why this happens. Why do some people develop this way and others don't? The answer is part biology, part experience. Start with temperament. Some people are born with a higher baseline sensitivity to social evaluation. Their nervous system is more reactive to things like eye contact, tone of voice, facial expressions. These are the kids who blush easily, who feel embarrassed when called on in class, who replay conversations in their head for days. Other kids are born with a lower sensitivity. They're less reactive to social cues, less disturbed by disapproval, less interested in fitting in. Neither is better, but they lead to very different developmental paths. If you were a low-sensitivity kid, you probably didn't internalize the social anxiety most other kids did. You didn't learn to see other people's opinions as existentially important, and as you grew up, that difference compounded. But temperament is only part of the story. Experience matters too, and this is where it gets darker. A lot of people who don't feel the need to impress were, at some point, excluded, rejected, overlooked, dismissed. Maybe you were the kid who didn't fit in, not because you were trying to be different, but because you just were. Maybe you learned early that performing for approval didn't work or didn't feel worth it. Maybe you tried to impress people and it backfired. Maybe you were punished for being yourself, so you stopped offering yourself up for evaluation. Here's what happens in those moments. Your brain makes a calculation. It says, social approval is costly, unreliable, and doesn't actually make me safer. So I'm going to stop prioritizing it. This isn't conscious. It's a deep limbic level decision. And once it's made, it reshapes everything. You stop performing. Not because you're confident, but because performing stopped making sense. This sounds contradictory, but some of the people who least need external validation are the ones who were denied it most harshly, because they had to build an internal foundation that could withstand that denial. They couldn't afford to base their worth on what others thought. So they didn't, and over time, that became their default. not bitterness, not detachment, just a quiet, unshakable sense that their value doesn't depend on being seen, and neuroscience explains why. The brain is incredibly adaptive. If external validation is inconsistent or painful, the brain reroutes reward pathways toward internal sources. Competence, autonomy, integrity, curiosity. You start finding meaning in things you can control, not things you have to beg for. And once that shift happens, going back feels hollow. Performing for applause starts to feel like a costume that doesn't fit anymore. Let me give you two profiles, two people. Same situation, different wiring. Person A walks into a work meeting. Their goal, whether they admit it or not, is to be perceived as competent, likable, valuable. They speak when they have something smart to say. They nod when others speak. They calibrate. They're not fake. They're socially intelligent. But every move is slightly curated. Person B walks into the same meeting. Their goal is to solve the problem being discussed. They speak if they have something useful to contribute. They don't speak if they don't. They're not trying to seem smart. They're trying to be accurate. If someone else has a better idea, they say so. If their own idea is flawed, they admit it. They're not performing competence. They're just competent, or trying to be. And here's the thing. Person A will probably be liked more initially because they're playing the social game well. Person B might be respected, feared, or misunderstood, but rarely immediately liked because they're not trying to be. Neither of these people is better. But they're living in different psychological worlds. Person A is oriented toward belonging. Person B is oriented toward accuracy. Person A asks, "How do I fit here?" Person B asks, "What's true here?" And both questions are valid. But if you're Person B, you've probably spent your whole life being told you should be more like Person A. More warm, more agreeable, more socially smooth, and maybe you've tried. But it feels exhausting, because you're not wired for that game. You're wired for a different one. And the moment you stop apologizing for that, everything shifts. Let's go deeper. One of the least talked about aspects of not needing to impress people is how it affects empathy. And this is important, because people will assume you lack empathy. They'll say you're cold, or selfish, or don't care about others. But that's not what's happening. Here's the reality. Empathy is not a single thing. There are different types. Cognitive empathy is understanding what someone else is thinking or feeling. Emotional empathy is feeling what someone else is feeling. Compassionate empathy is being moved to help. Most people assume that socially performative people are more empathetic. But that's not true. What they are is more socially compliant. They mirror emotions, match energy, perform care, because that's what the social script demands. But people who don't feel the need to impress often have extremely high cognitive and compassionate empathy. They understand people deeply. They care about people genuinely. They just don't perform that care in the expected ways. They won't tell you what you want to hear. They'll tell you what they think you need to hear. They won't comfort you with false reassurance. They'll sit with you in the discomfort. They won't perform concern. They'll offer actual help. And this gets misread constantly. Because here's the thing. Most people conflate social warmth with care. But social warmth is often just performance. Real care is quieter. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need applause. And if you're someone who cares deeply but doesn't perform it, people will miss it. They'll think you're indifferent, when really you're just not interested in performing concern for an audience. You're interested in actually helping the person in front of you. And there's a massive difference. This ties into identity. Most people build their identity around how others see them. I'm the funny one. I'm the responsible one. I'm the caretaker. I'm the rebel. These identities are socially constructed. They exist because others reinforce them. But people who don't need to impress often build identity differently. They build it around what they do, what they value, what they're capable of, not what others say about them. Their identity is privately held, and that makes it much more stable, because it doesn't collapse when the audience leaves. Here's a question. Have you ever noticed that you feel more like yourself when you're alone? Not lonely, not isolated, just alone. Because when no one's watching, you don't have to manage perception. You can just be. Most people find that idea terrifying. Being alone with themselves, no distractions, no validation, feels like freefall. But for you, it might feel like relief, because the performance stops, the noise stops, and you can finally hear yourself think. This isn't misanthropy. It's not avoidance. It's restoration. Your nervous system doesn't treat solitude as a threat. It treats it as a resource, and that's another neurological difference. Some brains are wired to seek social stimulation to regulate. Other brains are wired to seek solitude to regulate. Neither is wrong. But if you're the second type, living in a world designed for the first type, you're going to feel out of sync a lot of the time. Let's talk about meaning, because this is where it all comes together. Most people derive meaning from narratives, the story of their life, the roles they play, the way others see them. Their sense of purpose is often tied to being needed, being seen, being remembered. And there's nothing wrong with that, but people who don't feel the need to impress often derive meaning differently. They derive it from creation, not narration, from doing, not being seen doing, from competence, not recognition, from internal alignment, not external acclaim. They care less about the story and more about the substance, and this creates a completely different relationship with life. They're not asking, "How will this look?" They're asking, "Is this true? Is this worth doing? Does this matter to me?" And that shift from external validation to internal coherence is one of the most psychologically liberating things a person can experience. But it comes with a cost, because when you stop performing, people stop understanding you. They can't read you the way they read others. You don't give them the social cues they're used to. You don't laugh at jokes that aren't funny. You don't pretend to care about things you don't care about. You don't soften your edges to make others comfortable. And that makes you unpredictable, which to most people feels like a threat. So they label you intimidating, cold, arrogant, weird. And those labels hurt, even if you don't need their approval, because you're not trying to be any of those things. You're just trying to be honest. And the fact that honesty is so rare that it gets mistaken for hostility tells you everything you need to know about how most people operate. Here's something else. People who don't feel the need to impress are often deeply misunderstood in relationships. Romantic partners, friends, even family members will say, "I never know what you're thinking. You're hard to read. You don't need me." And what they mean is, you don't perform, need the way I expect. You don't seek reassurance. You don't fish for compliments. You don't need constant validation that I still like you. And to someone whose love language is validation, that feels like distance. But to you, it's not distance, it's trust. You trust that if something's wrong, you'll say it. You trust that your partner knows you care, even if you're not declaring it every day. You trust that love doesn't require performance. But not everyone has that trust, and that mismatch can create real friction, because they're waiting for you to perform love, and you're just loving them, quietly, steadily, without fanfare. Let me tell you what this isn't. This isn't about being better than other people. It's not about being smarter, deeper, or more enlightened. It's not about superiority. It's about difference. Your brain processes social reward differently. That's it. You're not broken. You're not missing something. You're not emotionally stunted. You're just wired in a way that doesn't prioritize external validation. And in a world that runs on external validation, that makes you an outlier. But outliers aren't defective. They're just operating on a different axis. And once you stop trying to fit on the axis everyone else is on, you stop feeling like something's wrong with you. Because nothing is. Now let's talk about flow. You know that state where time disappears? Where you're so absorbed in what you're doing that everything else fades? Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi spent decades studying this. He called it flow. And he found that people enter flow when they're engaged in something challenging, meaningful, and internally rewarding. Not when they're trying to impress someone, not when they're performing, but when they're fully present in the act itself. And here's the interesting part. People who don't feel the need to impress tend to experience flow more often, because they're not splitting their attention between the task and the audience. They're just in the task, fully, completely. And that's where the deepest satisfaction lives, not in applause, but in presence, in competence, in the quiet hum of doing something well. Not for recognition, but because it matters to you. Most people never experience that, because they're too busy watching themselves be watched. They're performing even when they're alone, rehearsing how they'll describe this moment later, imagining how it'll look on social media, calculating how it'll affect their image. They're never fully in the moment. They're always one step removed, managing perception. But you're not. When you're working on something, you're in it. When you're having a conversation, you're present. When you're thinking, you're actually thinking, not performing thought. And that gives you access to a kind of clarity most people never reach. Because clarity requires presence. And presence requires letting go of the audience, even the imagined one. Here's the truth. You've probably spent a lot of your life wondering if something's wrong with you. Why don't I care about the things other people care about? Why doesn't it bother me when people don't like me? Why do I feel more comfortable alone than in a crowd? Why does performing feel so exhausting? And the answer is simple. Nothing is wrong with you. You're just not wired for the game most people are playing. You're wired for a different game. One that values substance over image, accuracy over agreeability, internal coherence over external approval. And that game is just as valid, just as human, just as worthy. It's just quieter. And because it's quieter, people miss it. They assume you're not playing at all. But you are. You're just playing for different stakes. And here's what I want you to understand. The fact that you don't need to impress people doesn't mean you don't affect them. You do. Deeply. People remember you. Not because you tried to be memorable, but because you were real. In a world full of performances, realness is rare, and it leaves a mark. People might not always like you, but they'll respect you. They'll trust you. They'll come to you when they need the truth, not reassurance. They'll recognize that you're not trying to sell them anything, not an image, not a version of yourself, just yourself. And that's more valuable than being liked by everyone, because being liked by everyone means being no one in particular. And you were never interested in that. So if you've made it this far, here's what I want to leave you with. You are not broken. You are not missing some essential piece of humanity. You are not cold or arrogant or detached. You are wired differently. And that wiring gives you access to something most people never find, the ability to exist without an audience, to know yourself without needing others to confirm it, to find meaning in substance, not recognition, to be present, not performing. And that is not a flaw. That is a gift. A quiet, often misunderstood, deeply valuable gift. The world needs people like you, people who don't bend to social pressure, people who say what's true, not what's expected, people who care deeply but don't perform care, people who build things, solve things, create things, not for applause, but because it matters. So stop apologizing for who you are. Stop trying to fit a mold you were never meant to fit, and start recognizing that the very thing that makes you feel different is the thing that makes you invaluable. If this resonated with you, if you found yourself nodding along, recognizing yourself in these patterns, there's a lot more where this came from. We explore the psychology of people who think differently, feel differently, see the world through a lens most people don't even know exists. So stick around. And if you want to keep going deeper, there's a video on the psychology of people who prefer being alone that I think you'll find just as clarifying. But whether you watch it or not, I hope you leave here with this. You don't need to impress anyone. You never did, and that was never a problem. It was always a strength.